we'd invited a diverse set of people to be part of the conversation, and I think we had pretty good participation in some areas, but we were disappointed that none of the indigenous groups accepted the invitation to participate. But we do have people that are really advocates, I think, of strong rights for traditional cultural expressions, and people that are more skeptical. I mean, I think it's a diverse set of views. We're not trying to come up with like text or negotiations per se. I think that the objective was to what I plan to do, and I'd like to know if anyone has any problems with that. What I would like to do is to go through the negotiating text, and I think right now apparently we're working from the 2003 version, which is document 49-5 for the IGC, because at the last meeting they rejected the work that was being done at the last meeting, and with some reference to two new WIPO documents. One's a glossary of how terms are defined, and the other one, the other document is an update of a technical review of issues in the draft text, and that's 50/IFN/8. The glossary document is IC-5. I think people here are really pretty sophisticated with WIPO documents. So if you go to the Wen's here, good. So if you go to the WIPO page on the IGC 50 meeting, you'll be able to get links to all the documents we'll be kind of referred to. So Wen, for your benefit, I don't know if you were on before earlier, but our objective was not to try and negotiate text per se, but to go through the text and listen to people about their views on different articles in the text, and try and understand both what people here think are the main issues and negotiations leading up to the meeting that's coming up pretty soon. Now, I would like to start. There's a lot of people here, and rather than go through a lot of introductions right now, the format I'd like to do is to, if it's okay with people, I'd like to kind of go through the text article by article, begin with and not spend a huge amount of time on every article, but to sort of allow people to kind of weigh in on some of the things. But before we do that, there's a little background I'd like to people to share. People have been working this a long time, and there's two people in particular. Wen, who spent a fair amount of his professional life working on these issues, and it's really graciously a joy to join us and give us some background on negotiation. And then Mahali Fixer, who is a legendary figure in IP in general, but also in this particular topic. And I'd like both of them to just maybe share a few thoughts before
Stop it.
Okay, so
go ahead.
So I'll start with Wen. Wen, did you want to offer a few comments before we start going through and commenting on the text?
Jamie, thank you very much, and apologies for being a bit late. I had a bit of an IT issue. I defer to Micheli, of course, who is has been in this even longer than I have, and he is a world-renowned expert. So I think let me keep my remarks brief, and then we can hear from him. I wanted to say, Jamie, thank you. And yes, it's been a long, the IGC has been meeting since 2001. So that's what, 24 years. And dealing with a subject matter that is enigmatic, multidisciplinary, involving multiple international instruments and different policy areas, and has brought into the IP policymaking space a range of new stakeholders that were never part of IP treaty making in the past. So it's been an extremely exciting and interesting process. Many ups and downs, a lot more back than forth often. And And it's been a long and winding road, of course, culminating part of the IGC's work, one of the work streams, culminating in the treaty that was adopted in May of last year, which I know is not the focus of this afternoon. But if I may, I wanted to say two things about process just before we get into the text, because process is very important. You know, if the oven is broken, the bread is not going to rise. So let's first fix the oven. And the process is broken, as we saw in the last IGC session, IGC 49. And, you know, after almost 25 years, the IGC is in something of a rut, working by rote, and some fresh ideas would be very helpful. I don't have the answers, but I'd like to make two comments or float two ideas, if I may. The first relates to the effect of the treaty adopted last year. So this is the GRATK treaty that was adopted in May of last year. As we saw in IGC 49, it was very present. It was in the room. And for some, it is a source of inspiration, of heightened expectations. And for others, it's a source of concern. It's causing a withdrawal or a sort of pulling back. So the new treaty is either a halo, shedding new light and new inspiration, or it's for some, it's sort of a dark shadow, casting a dark cloud, casting a shadow over the rest of the IGC. And I think it's important to draw the right lessons from the treaty's adoption of last year. In the TCE negotiations, the texture of the discussions is different, the substance is different, and the alignment of perspectives is quite different. And so it's not a rinse and repeat. It's not a copy paste. The second thing I wanted to mention briefly is the drawing again on the experience of last year at the diplomatic conference. What I thought was very helpful was that the President Conference, Ambassador Patriota, and the main committee chairs, McAllister from Australia and Vivian from Namibia, they set out what they called guardrails or guiding principles. And I think something like that for the IGC going forward could be very helpful. The texts at the moment are part of the problem. The methodology is part of the problem. We've used the same methodology for so many years now. And the mandate itself hasn't changed in over 20 years. Hasn't changed much. And so I'd like to end by leaving the thought behind, or the suggestion, that it could be helpful for the IGC to discuss some general guiding principles in terms of its objectives, what it's trying to achieve, and some sort of guardrails around process and substance. And I think that would be a very helpful contribution to the process. And thank you again for inviting me, and I defer to my former boss, Micheli.
Thank you for the invitation. I begin with making some explanation why I haven't prepared better for this discussion. Very simply, my wife last Friday fell, and both of her wrists broke. So we were in hospitals, X-ray, MR, again control. But nevertheless, I've read again the model provisions on the protection of the expressions of folklore, as we called it at that time. Can you hear me?
Yes.
In June 1982. And also the study I made, and it was published in the book, which contains the material of the World Symposium we held in Phuket in April 1997. You know, during the arithmetic conference in December 1996, developing countries asked us to address inter alia also the protection of the expressions of folklore. And then what I did recently this year, I participated in WIPO program for 8 ORP countries. ORP is the regional non-NGO, but IGO of the Francophone countries in Africa. So that is what I've reviewed again. And I looked into this series of draft provisions also, which are on the agenda. And yes, I've noted what was said in the introduction, that the text is very far from being suitable to go ahead. Perhaps the methodology may be reviewed, the mandate may be reviewed, but I stopped at a certain moment when I read the following text, and I read to you. Protection under this instrument does not extend to traditional cultural expressions that are widely known. What kind of expressions are widely known? Which are widely known or used outside the community of the beneficiaries as defined in this. Okay, so if such thing is still in the draft, then we are extremely far away for anything which may come up. So I understand my colleagues in WIPO. But what I've noted this when I went through the model provisions, and I tried to recall the discussions which took place. Actually, it began I think in 1978, and then we had several meetings when we arrived in June 1992 in the big conference hall in the bunker, but also the so-called internet treaties were adopted later. So what we have found in these preparatory meetings is that we may progress the better if we do not extend the preparatory work to so many multidisciplinary aspects. And if we concentrate on artistic folklore, first of all. And then in the model provisions, actually, artistic folklore is only covered, and then we differentiated between 4 categories of expressions of folklore. And we kept also in mind, which is not in the model provisions, but it's a reality that of the 4 categories, there are actually 2 where the protection of expressions of folklore, first of all, is very much important, and where it functions, at least in certain countries and in certain way. So we differentiated between expressions of folklore expressed in words, this folk, tale, and so on. It's a very special category. There are some collections or folk. So let us. It is not where it is. It's important. No, I don't say it not. But then where it is very much important is the protection of expressions, musical expressions, and when it does function. And I think that when I mentioned how it functions, I also would like to point out at the same time that it would be nice and important to take into account where actually there are already provisions in national laws and how it functions. In this study that I prepared in 1997, I found 32 countries, but the majority, about 27, were in Africa. And Africa is different than Latin America or Asia, very much different from the United States and Canada or Europe. In Africa, the folklore is a living tradition, is still developing. That's the very important channel of expression and development of cultural heritage. It is not a kind of monument which may be maintained or should be maintained. It is more the identity of these people than, let's say, in a European country, industrialized country. Now, so this is one thing. And then musical folklore does function. There are various systems that where it really functions is through collective management. And then it's very much different, the management, as the management of protected works, that they include in the authorization of certain users the two things together, and they collect the two together. And as far as distribution is concerned, well, it's very much interesting because it may be very much a good information for the negotiations that the right of remuneration, how and for what purposes may be used. It is there too where an issue emerged which somehow is not covered in the this series of draft provisions which will be discussed at the beginning of March. Namely, okay, it was in the same way in the model provisions in 1982, and it seems to be the same, that among the exceptions of using expressions of folklore appears also the creation of protectable works, that is, original works. Now, in Africa, there are some national laws where they differentiate between two things: folklore proper, that is, traditional expressions, and then the kind of adaptations of folklore, where a member of the community or somebody else in the country contributes to the folklore in a way that it corresponds to the adaptation in the field of musical works. And in this case, the system is in many countries that a certain percentage goes to the adapter, but the rest goes as any other remuneration which they collect, where it's not possible to identify such an individual adapter for general cultural purposes, the promotion of creativity, and in certain cases, the to promote the maintenance, identification, digitization of folklore. I'd like to mention that in Hungary, we have a similar system in the collective management organization where the adapter only receives a certain percentage, certain, let's say, 50% because the modification is so big, or 25 because it's not so big. Now, though you should also consider this as a possibility. No, I speak too much, and I have to. No, I like to mention the other important group because dance also important. Yes, recording audiovisual works and so on. But the fourth and very important category is the folklore expressions which are products. And there it is not really just the traditional copyright uses are important. They should be there also. So in general, we may in a way copy the copyright categories, reproduction, distribution, communication to public. But in this case, the market control is very much important against a kind of passing off. This is also in the model provisions. And there's some other aspects where not copyright, but for example, collective marks, for example, appellation of origin, unfair competition. So what I like to say is that we have to take into account where already systems exist. The differences between the continents, Africa is very special in that respect. Also, there are many least developing countries that are, and then concentrating in our mind in any provision what we prepare on these two important categories. Not forgetting about the other, but these two, musical folklore combined with collective management. Now, I like to mention still something, and then I stop, and then may go through different issues. That in 1992, we adopted the model provisions. About 32 countries applied this in this way or that way. And in 1984, we tried to transform the model provisions into binding international treaties with certain modifications. And then two main arguments emerged, mainly from, of course, the developed industrialized countries. First, they said that, okay, we accept, let us presume, some obligation to protect folklore. But do we know that the expressions of folklore in which country? And first of all, are these expressions identified? So this is an important thing now, identification and the solution of the so-called regional folklore, where later we spoke about that in WIPO, we said that a kind of collective system may be used. OAP, I mentioned, Western Francophone countries. The borders have been drawn in a way that the tribes and communities, which are the same, have the same folklore. So one thing is sure, that these kinds of folklore are from this region. So if they come together and they offer this as an interface that, okay, we know that this is from our region. So if we agree that it should be protected, we are ready to arrange this somehow. Okay, no, there is something still and I finish. We speak about AI. And of course, folklore will be there too. But I speak about the model. The owners of rights, first of all, authors and performers, they insist that there should be a transparency in the input and also transparency in the output when protected works are applied. And it may emerge also in the case of folklore. Folklore is a kind of, it may be considered domaine public payant from the viewpoint of copyright. But in order that we may really apply in practice any kind of system of remuneration, there should be some kind of identification when folklore creations are used in that way, and also when there is an output in the market, for example, concerning adaptation and so on. I stop it. Sorry. I like speaking. There is only one thing that I don't like, to stop speaking. Sorry, but I stop now. I'm dangerous, ladies and gentlemen, dangerous. You shouldn't give me the floor.
I think that was really helpful for everyone to get some of this background. And I think most of us are, there's a mixture of people on this call. There's some people that are like Wendt and Mihaly, really deeply versed in the background, and others of us are probably a bit newer to it. And I think for all of us, I think that was really helpful. Thank you very much. Now, what I had suggested earlier was that we spend some time in the call going through the text that is listed on the web page for the consideration of the meeting, which is 49/5 rather, what's essentially the 2023 negotiating text. Because as people recall from last year, after a session of the IGC, the draft that was proposed and by the facilitators and suggested was rejected and not published. And so are people okay with that idea that we sort of go through the text from the beginning toward the end and have people kind of share some thoughts on it? Or do people, want to push back on that proposal? No, not here. I'm not going to wait too long on that one. So the first thing I would encourage people to do is to pull up on, I assume that you have access to the text. If you can pull up, if you go to the web page for IGC 50, you can find this document 49/5, which is the it starts right away. It just shares an older June 7, 2023 version of the negotiating text. And I'd like to basically start with the idea that there's a preamble and an introduction to the text. And I'd like to know if anyone on the call, particularly negotiators that have been involved in negotiation, or anyone else that really feels they have strong opinion, do they want to make any comments on the current draft? The preamble is pretty long. It's 14 paragraphs right now. If anyone wants to raise their hand, let me see if I can see where the hand raisings are here.
I don't see any hands raised yet, but that could change.
Okay,
Real hand.
Graham is raising his hand.
Oh, I couldn't find the hand, so I thought, let's use a real hand this time. Okay, yeah. I mean, the preamble is.
Graham, could you first? I think almost everyone here knows who you are, but could you just give a couple of sentences to explain who you are?
Oh yeah. I assume no one does, and then maybe a few do. But okay, Graham Duckfield. I've been involved in this stuff for about 30 years, but I've never been on any official kind of delegation. I'm always a bit of an outsider, but I guess I'm known to a few people for my views. Yeah, so I don't look at this from a position of people who are right in the midst of it and have to deal with the mess. I can sort of, from outside, and maybe that doesn't always make me particularly helpful, but nonetheless, I'll just say, I mean, the preamble is one mustn't underestimate the importance of the preamble. And I look at it and I think it's a bit of a mess, and I mean, I could sort of just take any part of it, So, I mean, some of it obviously is quite easy to sort of agree with. Now, so if you look at 5, it says acknowledging that traditional cultural expressions are frameworks of ongoing creation and distinctive intellectual and creative life. Yeah, I mean, there's mention here about creativity and innovation, and actually, traditional cultural expressions can be creative, can be innovative, but on the other hand, sometimes it is traditional, sometimes actually it is old, it's not all evolving, because we used to say, look, it's important that we don't treat it as just old stuff, because it deserves respect on the basis that it is evolving and changing. But sometimes when indigenous people talk about tradition, they're not just talking about about new and changing stuff. They're also talking about things that have been important to them for a very, very long time. So if we use the language of creativity and innovation, we push the whole thing in a certain direction. And that's not always where I think they actually want to go. It's not all about creativity and innovation. And that leads us to in particular directions in terms of how we deal with this legally. So I think these are things that are incredibly important. They're embedded in cultural and spiritual values, but not. Think this is valuable not just because it's evolving, it's creative and innovative. It has other value that's actually more important than just that. So I just want to make that point. I could say more, but maybe I don't want to make a speech, so I'll just put that across.
Okay, do other people want to make comments on the preamble? I mean, it is a bit of there's a lot of different thoughts in there, or we could move on to.
Sorry, may I say something?
Absolutely.
I wouldn't concentrate on the preamble. The preamble sometimes is a kind of reversing engineering of what you agree on. So it indicates the objective and the purpose, of course, but if you have a article somewhere on the concept of folk, you need a definition, and you should go there, and then somewhere about the objective, but
yeah, I agree.
I think that if you concentrate too much on the preamble, sometimes the preamble is prepared after that everything is ready. So sorry, I don't want to. I would suggest to use your time in the on the. No, I wanted to use the word guano, but I avoid this.
I think it's worth 2 minutes, though. Still
complex.
Let's move to Article 1, which is the use of terms. This is how terms are defined. Now, in 49/5, there are very few terms that are defined in this article. And I think there was more done on this, quite a bit more done on this in the negotiation last year that is not reported here. And WIPO is also has this other document, which is, I think, quite important to look at, which is the glossary of terms document. And that is, you can find it on the webpage for the, I can put a link in here for people that want to make sure they're looking at the same. I put a link in there to the glossary. The glossary is 49 pages long. And one of the terms that I thought was really important was the idea of, we'll get to it more on the beneficiaries, but I was always kind of curious as to how local communities are defined in the treaty, because they're not actually defined in this particular treaty text. And in the glossary, on page 21 of the glossary, there's a fairly extensive discussion, which starts out with saying that that there's no common definition of local communities, and I just wondered if there are other things if people have comment on what's in the definitions right now, which are, they just have 3 terms, no, 4. I think they have 4 terms in the current Article 1 on the use of terms. If there are things that you want to say about what's either in the current terms defined in Article 1 or things that you think should be defined in there, and I will throw out local communities is something that I think is pretty interesting to see how it's been addressed in other agreements, or you'll see it when we get to other parts of the text where there's reference to it. You can sort of see the context of which it's described in this particular text, but also in the glossary. It's really useful to see how it's defined in other agreements, which are not consistent with each other. But does anyone want to make a comment on Article 1 on the use of terms and sort of discuss anything that you see in that text? Scott, do you have anything to say?
Yeah, you know, I still, in the model provisions, we concentrated on the national law which will implement the model provisions, and then therefore we spoke about the cultural expressions developed and maintained in the country by, and then we didn't concentrate on too much by whom, but in the territory. Of course, we said that communities, but the community may be just the nation, maybe just a nationality, maybe just a tribe, and then of course indigenous people are a very special category. And then I like very much that's what I like in the draft provisions, that you differentiate between so-called controlled expressions of folklore, such as sacred folklore, religious folklore, and then the rest. But the first category, the controlled expressions, is a very special, small. That's where you really should identify the community special, which is supposed to be in the position not only to collect remuneration, but also authorize. So I think that what is important is to narrow to a group of people, is that otherwise, in many countries, you know, at least in Central Europe, where there are small countries, folklore is nationwide folklore. Except that the most beautiful folklore creations, as far as music is concerned, are now in Romania. But that's another business, that's the history.
Can I ask, when on the definition of traditional cultural expressions, you do see this parsing out verbal forms, musical forms, expressions of movement, tangible or intangible forms of expression, and combinations. Is there kind of a particular previous instruments, of which I guess there are many that you think?
There's the model provision, the same categories.
Yeah, and when is that your take on it too?
That's exactly right, Jamie. So this the model provisions from 1982 actually followed the 1976 model law on copyright. In fact, the folklore discussion goes back to the very early 1960s. I think the first recorded discussion was a meeting in 1962.
I'm walking home.
And someone's walking home. Good. Okay.
Canada.
Okay.
Anyway, but these categories come from the model provisions and possibly also from the 1976 model law. And I would just make 1 or 2 comments. One is whether it's necessary in an international legal instrument to go into that level of detail. I mentioned earlier what I think is important is for the delegations to agree on a couple of guardrails, a couple of guiding principles. And I think one of those would be to clarify that the purpose of an international legal instrument is to provide high-level guidance to standardize a few issues, but at a sort of level of principle, and allowing lots of room for national flexibility and local sovereignty. And so I personally don't think it's appropriate for an international legal instrument to go into this level of detail, particularly in a subject matter as diverse as TCEs, and countries should be free to provide that kind of detail in their national laws according to the national systems. And the other just general comment, seeing I have the floor, is to say that a little bit like the preamble, I think Article 1 on the use of terms is something to be discussed a bit later, because it's important that this article only contains terms that are actually used in the rest of the treaty. So, and in some cases, the terms may not end up being in the treaty. So to spend time early on negotiating the terms is probably premature. And certainly something like publicly available, there's a lot of history behind that concept, of course. And for the IGC to define a term like that would be quite a big step, but it would only be necessary if there was the tiered approach, for example, if the concept mattered, and the concept may not matter in the end. So I think it's premature at this stage to focus too much on Article 1.
Well, can I is there anything in the definition of traditional cultural expressions that's, I mean, that isn't a traditional cultural expression? I mean, it seems pretty broad, right? If you have dynamic and evolving verbal forms, musical forms, expressions of movement, tangible and intangible.
No, this detail, yeah.
I mean,
Actually, you may also use the technique, what we used in 1996, and then later also, that certain issues are in the some kind of ugly statements, some details, and then the essence is included only in the provisions. That is, I must tell you that what is in the draft provisions, the definition is more or less okay, but I noticed something what we didn't include in 82, namely that also not only what is developed and maintained by the community, but also what received and further developed and maintained. So there's a new element, and then okay, that's what I can see there as a new thing, that it is not necessary that something is born somewhere in the history, but arrives later, and then it's accepted by the community and further develops step by step. And that's what I saw it as a new thing.
well, one thing that came up in the last meeting of the IGC, and I mean, I proposed this question, but I think other people shared this question, is like, you know, is rap or reggae music, does that qualify as a traditional cultural expression? I mean, does it have to be like, is there some kind of boundary to what would be considered when?
Jeremy, sorry, yeah, I can't find the hand thing, like Graham, I can't find the hand thing on the Zoom menu, so I'll just use the
Go ahead.
physical hand. I think something to point out is that this text distinguishes between traditional cultural expressions generally as a sort of concept, and that's what's defined in Article 1. But it has the device of defining then in Article 3 protected cultural expressions. And I think that's where you find the narrowing and the criteria for protection, Jamie, which gets to your point about which cultural expressions would be protectable under this instrument. And that's a good way of looking at it. I think there's cultural expressions generally, and that's very, very wide and could apply to almost anything, I think. But the instrument is aimed at protecting traditional cultural expressions according to the criteria in Article 3. And that's been a feature of the IGC's texts from the very beginning for some decades, actually.
Okay, well, I suggest that we move on to Article 2 on the objectives, which um, um, I think some of us, if you at the last meeting, I was struck by the fact that, like, if you look at the objectives in the TRIPS agreement, they reflect more balance between the users and the owners of the IP. And you have references in Articles 8, 7, and 8 of the TRIPS agreement on objectives and principles, which are and this doesn't seem that way to me. Well, you see it actually in some versions, like Alternative 2, balance and adequate. So that the word balance, which I know is quite controversial. If you look at I mentioned these 2 new documents that were done in published by WIPO in January of this year. There's this one document called Update of the Technical Review, and the update of the technical review really goes after the word balanced. It doesn't like that. It says that you know, they kind of reject that. Would you say that's fair, Wendt, this document on the update of the technical review of key intellectual property issues?
Yeah, sure, Jamie. And just for those who maybe don't know, that's a document. It's a set of comments on the texts that were prepared by 2 or 3 Indigenous experts. It was a recommendation coming from the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues some years ago that we do this review, which we did. And we've done it now twice, actually, 2 different groups of experts. And yes, it has been a feature of the Indigenous Caucus's point of view. And I think actually that at IGC 49, Preston Hardison, who many of us also know and respect, speaking for the caucus, I think was also very clear on this point on exceptions and limitations, that the caucus rejects there being any exceptions and limitations because of, and that's linked to this question about balance. And I don't recall exactly what Preston said, but I recall he said something along those sort of lines.
Right.
And that has been a consistent view, actually. It's been a consistent view of the caucus for many, many years.
Yeah, and if I could, I mean, I had a lot of sidebars with him on that, and I guess this is kind of a deeper thing in the agreement. I was sort of saying, like, look at every other intellectual property agreement has this sort of idea of exceptions and balance and things like that. And I tried to bring up that there are some, and he said, well, he said there, and it gets into who the beneficiaries are. And I brought up in the beneficiaries that one of the beneficiaries would be society. And he said, it's not society, it's just the Indigenous communities, although the agreement's broader than Indigenous, of course. And I said, well, society cares about cultural diversity. Society cares about protecting their history and their culture. They also protect about the dignity of different people. I mean, so a society, even though they're not the primary economic beneficiaries or the people, the right holders, they still value some of the things you get by protecting cultural expressions and traditional cultural expressions. So, and they didn't like that. But I said, you know, you want people to you know, join the treaty and enforce the treaty. I mean, maybe you should think a little bit about, like, why should they? I mean, like, what's in it for them, and think a bit more positive about what you know, the general public might think of the thing. But he wasn't really too keen on that. But this word balance, you know, I'm glad that you bring it up. That's a long held position. I sort of got the impression that his position was that, look, we have sovereign law, we don't recognize your laws, our laws are really you know, really primary, and we don't want you bring in your you know, your views into what our law should be. Like we just don't accept that. We're completely sovereign. And one of the things I thought was problematic was that I used to live in Alaska, and there was not like one native culture. There were like, there was, I grew up initially it was part of an Aleut community, and then I helped raise a kid who was part of part of an Athabascan tribe, and I knew people in different tribes, and they didn't agree with each other. The way they did things was different, and I didn't understand how the concept of sovereignty could be exported worldwide, since they weren't all the same in terms of what their views were. And Haley, you know this topic better than I do, and also Graham and others. Graham, you've got your hand up. Why don't you weigh in on this issue?
May I say something? This is a principle balance. And of course, it depends what you accept as obligation. So if you accept the obligation, you should be clarified to what extent you accept it. And then if you don't speak about exceptions to the obligation that, for example, you have to pay, then there is no balance. So first of all, certain cases, as in the Berne Convention, for example, should be specified specifically. And then you may have something else which is not the same, but the function may be similar, which is the three-step test, that is some general principles to be applied otherwise when you establish, in addition to the specific exceptions, limitations, some others. So, if you include in a paragraph in the article that there should be balance, then it is very much similar to a preamble paragraph, even if it's expressed as a principle, it may relate to anything what is applied as exception, limitation, to any general provision similar as this three-step test.
Yeah, if I could add here, and I want to get Graham to make his comment on this, but Mahaly was, among other things, was one of the authors, if not the main author, of the one three-step decision at the WTO on a dispute on copyright between the United States and the European Union. So it was
may I mention something, because it relates to what I've said, that in the TRIPS agreement, there's Article 7 and 8, and then the European Community said that it's like the preamble. So when we apply the three-step test, it has been taken into account. So we shouldn't take into account in the three-step test. While Canada said that we applied the three-step test, and then we may go back to the objectives and principles. And the panel said that we have to take into account when we apply the three-step test. So these are principles and some kind of general guidelines how to apply principles when you apply some provisions of the treaty. So it's not different than anything else which is in the specific provisions and exception limitation. Sorry.
Graham.
Thank you. Right. Yeah. I have to say I sort of share some of your views, Jamie, but I also lean slightly more towards Preston. Now the thing is that in IP very generally, to me, there is a bit of a tension between, IP as a kind of natural right. I mean, I'm talking not about America or UK here. I'm talking, Europe as well and other parts of the world. So there is this sort of tension. So there's some might say, well, what does it have to do with balance? And also, if you talk about balance, you're being thought utilitarian, and not everyone thinks about this in a utilitarian sense. Besides which, where is the balance in trade secrecy? Is there any at all? I mean, look at what happened in COVID. I don't see any balance at all in trade secrecy. So sometimes we talk about balance. I don't see any balance in trade secrecy. And also, if you're talking about honor and reputation of authors, that's about dignity, and that's not about balance. So I think it's much more complex than perhaps this conversation might be going into.
Are there other people that make comment on Article 2 on the objectives? There's like there's a facilitator's version, and then there's 3 alternatives, and they don't list, like, who put forward the where the text came from, but you'll notice it's going through the text. I mean, some of them look like they're more Group B kind of industrialized countries comments, and some of them will look like they're more coming from, more leaning toward the indigenous caucus, not completely point of view. And so I mean, one of the reasons why it's hard to why the negotiations have been challenging is because there's a fairly significant gap in, and we haven't heard from too many of the negotiators yet, but I know there's people from Brazil and from Indonesia on the call, and I just wonder and from the United States, I just wonder if among other countries, if any of you want to weigh in on this issue of the objectives. Carolina, do you want to say anything, for example? Or I see we have Christina from Canada. No?
I'd like to ask a question, because I haven't found this in these many draft provisions, whether you differentiate in the same way as in the model provisions. There is something that where there may be authorization and or remuneration is concerning those kinds of usage of expressions of folklore, which are both with gainful intent and outside the traditional or customary context. That is, a member of the community which has maintained and developed and maintained the expression may use that kind of knowledge for going to the market, for example, or perform something which is different. Do you differentiate this in the draft provisions? Because that's a kind of entry that is when you decide whether at all you apply any obligation to pay or authorization. Of course, it is a secret or religious folklore. It's obvious that they do that. But for example, when you put in the market terracotta or something like that, you, of course, if you're a member of the community, you can do that, even if you do it for income. But if somebody comes from outside and do that, that's different. And if a member of the community goes outside the context and then transform the folklore in a way that it becomes something else, which is not necessarily the folklore anymore, then again, there may be, of course, some other conflict.
Well, one thing I'd be interested in hearing is, if people look at Article 2 in this 2023 text we're looking at, do people favor any of the alternatives? I mean, I just like kind of lay it out like that, like Scott, for example. Can we get you to represent in Paramount? Can you shed any light on the views of your company on anything in the objectives? But
yeah, I mean, our concern as, storytellers and filmmakers and film distributors, really, I think, crosses all of the provisions, beginning with the definitions, and then, on through objectives and everything else. And, the frustration that we have is, what we need is, as storytellers and filmmakers, is clarity and certainty. And that, as I say, plays out across all of the provisions. So we need to know which rights are protected. And, alluded to the provision that it's difficult for an international treaty to pin that down. But when you refer to secret and sacred, what is secret and sacred? Who knows? Who defines? When you have provisions that refer to elements that are widely known, again, who decides what is widely known? So we have that concern about what is the scope. As Vent said, you have the broad scope and then the narrower scope of what's protected, but even that narrower scope doesn't really give us a lot of guidance. Then we have a concern about who's the owner of these rights, or who do you go to? Is it the state? Is it the community? If it's the community, how do you deal with cultures that overlap modern state boundaries, or migratory cultures like Polynesian culture, where you may have domestic laws that are inconsistent but apply to the same folklore or elements? And then clarity for what is the scope of the restriction. Is it a prohibition, as Mahali mentioned? Is it collective management? We see in some of these domestic laws, there are even criminal provisions. We see that in Nigeria. I think we see that in Mexico. How does that play out? And then what kind of safe harbors are there for creating new creative works, for storytelling? What I think Jamie referred to as the societal benefit of sharing these traditions, keeping them alive. And when we contrast this to the copyright regime, we have certainty and clarity on all of those points. And so we have the guidance that we need when we're telling our stories. The area I think we have, that we as storytellers, as modern storytellers, see the greatest need is for what you might call advice. When we want to be accurate, we want to be respectful, but where do you go to find out whether your version of folklore or your use of folklore is accurate to begin with, is respectful and appropriate? It's something we've talked to WIPO about, whether WIPO, a repository. If you think of what we do with films in the US, you always see a credit at the end that the ASPCA, the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, certified that no animals were mistreated during the production. Well, if there was a body you could go to get that type of TCE seal of approval, that depictions of traditional forms of culture or expression are accurate, appropriate, that would be hugely helpful in our storytelling production world. And then the other thought in trying to move this process forward, that alluded to this, Mahali alluded to it, is is there a difference between storytelling and commercial products like apparel? There have been litigations or instances in Mexico where they have asserted claims where indigenous designs, I believe Inca designs, were used by high-end fashion companies in commercial products. Is that a line that could be drawn in order to move this forward while still preserving the societal benefit that Jamie alluded to? So those concerns, that desire, crosses every single provision of the treaty. So it's a little hard, for us to focus on bracketed things within one. But that's the approach we're taking to it, of wanting to be respectful, wanting to be accurate, but also wanting to be able to tell our stories like Disney's Day of the Dead film, that I think was very respectful to Mexican, Latin American tradition and culture, but also shared that history with people who otherwise wouldn't have known about it.
Wow, that's really
I agree.
really helpful. Luis, you've been a WIPO negotiator. You spent a fair amount of time on the issue of balance in the copyright system. Do you have any reactions to the Article 2 and objectives the way it's currently set out?
Thank you, James, for pointing me out. At this moment, I'm just a spectator and still have not been able to make analysis, so I won't go there. But definitely, as a principle, I think that it's critical that we have an instrument that includes a clear a tool to provide balance, either by limitations or exceptions or other forms of limitations, because we know that each country at some point will need to have some carve out for their social interest.
Okay, did anyone else want to make a comment on the objectives before we move to the Article 3, which is on the protection criteria and eligibility, which pointed out really early on as one of the most important articles, in the sense that it defines what types of cultural expressions would be protected by an instrument. Are we okay to move to Article 3? Article 3 is when you want to sort of introduce Article 3 and provide some context?
Sure, Jamie. And my camera's not working. I don't know why. So sorry about that, but I'm still here. And right. So this article is obviously a critical one. It is beginning to define the protectable subject matter, and not to be confused, of course, with the scope of protection article, which is Article 5, is also important. But this has been long discussed, and the wording that you find in Article 3 actually was partly inspired, again, by the old historical texts of the Tunis Model Law from 1976 and the model provisions from 1982. And the challenge has always been to find the language that expresses the connection between the cultural expression and the indigenous people or local community that is the holder, or other stakeholder that is the holder. And that link and is the language that is needed, and that the facilitators have attempted to convey in their alternative, Article 3.1. And then there's 2 alternatives as well. And there was a very good discussion on this in IGC 49. And, you know, one of the many issues is, which links back to the beneficiaries question. There's a close connection between Article 3 and the beneficiaries article. And that is, who exactly are the holders? And one doesn't want an instrument like this to benefit other holders, like an archive or a museum or a sort of cultural entity. So that, I hope that's an introduction. And some of the newer concepts that were not in the earlier texts from the early sort of 70s, 80s, are concepts like received by and revealed to. These are certainly new ideas that were not in the earlier texts.
You're talking about the facilitator's alternative, right? Well, I guess it pops up in all the versions, right?
Right, yeah.
Received and revealed to, yeah. Could you elaborate a little bit on this? Even though we're not quite the beneficiaries yet, but like this idea of archives is being like not people do not want this to be a right that benefits them. Is it? Could you just elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, there's a good discussion at IGC 49, and I think actually Switzerland was especially articulate on this point, if I remember correctly, that when one talks about, you know, we've often used the term holders, and that also comes a bit from the TK, more from the biodiversity side of things, which of course also reminds us of the issue that we have 2 separate texts at the moment, in the there's a long history behind that, and there are suggestions that the two texts ought to be consolidated in some sort of way. But the point that some delegations made was that when we talk about holders, we mean the communities that were from whom the expressions came, and not sort of newer holders like museums, which happen to have archival collections and happen to have cultural expressions in their collection. So they're custodians of these collections, of these cultural expressions, but they are not the holders that we are speaking about when we talk about the beneficiaries of the protection or the beneficiaries of the instrument, which also might be two different things, of course.
I noticed this is a kind of technical thing, but I noticed that in some cases you have references to indigenous, and then they have peoples, you know, kind of typically in brackets, and then local communities, which obviously are designed to be different from people who are indigenous. And so, for example, African Americans who are descended of slaves certainly, you know, wouldn't be indigenous in the United States, but they might be considered a local community. But sometimes you get reference to other beneficiaries. And I know, like in Article 1, they have in brackets other beneficiaries, and then in Article 3, it doesn't seem to appear. What is this? What's going on with all this talk about other beneficiaries? Because that, you know, it's hard enough to get my head around local communities. But what do people mean by other beneficiaries? Like, where, you know, where that's going?
I think that
what is that?
Yeah, I think that states want flexibility to vest the rights and the benefits in entities other than the local communities or indigenous peoples. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some countries don't recognize indigenous peoples, capital I, capital P with the S, you know, the sort of formal concept. And there are a number of countries, and again, going back to the national, I'll use the term folklore because that was the term used in the 60s and 70s and 80s. If you look at many of the national laws that implemented folklore protection back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, they vested the rights in the state, actually.
Okay.
A national folklore board in Ghana, you know, for example. And the argument there is that number of reasons. One is that, in fact, everyone is of the same group and therefore really belongs to the nation as a whole, to the state as a whole. One other argument is that actually it's the state that funds normally the, you know, safeguarding and the protection of cultural heritage, and therefore the state should be the beneficiary of the protection and of the rights. So I think other beneficiaries or other holders, other stakeholders is really mostly about states.
Okay, that's really, yeah, I kind of, yeah, yeah, reading a lot of national laws, that's pretty obvious.
May I say something? We avoided this, what has been said is absolutely in this way. There are many national laws now where actually the state considers that the folklore developed in the territory, maintained, it is a national property. But we haven't identified this, but it has been described somehow in the model law how these provisions are applicable. And then it's indicated that who may exercise any right of authorization or any other rights, such as right of collection, and then who does so for the benefit of whom. And then it has been mentioned that promotion of national culture, and of course, in this case, it is the state, the government, which does something, or say, the promotion of creativity. At that time, actually, there was not too many ideas in addition to sacred and religious folklore to concentrate on a specific group within the country. It was left absolutely to the governments how they apply this, that. And then, of course, not only in the way that collect, but also protect folklore against something.
So,
And it's the state. It is the state.
so other beneficiaries gives the flexibility. If it's bracketed, of course, but it would give them. Now, the Indigenous Caucus, I think, doesn't really like that, right? The other beneficiaries.
That's okay.
They would not like that, I think, Jamie. I think I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but I think they would.
Oh no, that's what I was suggesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good.
And that's been a long-standing position of theirs, right?
Right.
And what's the position of countries like Brazil on that? Or
Asking me, Jamie, or you asking the?
Yes, is that we have a couple people from Canada here. Can you tell me how you address that issue, the other beneficiaries issue in Canada? Or we have people from Indonesia, Switzerland. We have different negotiators here. Michael Shapiro, you're here from the USPTO. Ariel Schultz? No?
Hi, Jamie. So I will say we are here. We are here to listen. We are not able to speak on what the U.S. positions are in the meeting, but obviously can refer you to the minutes from the last meeting.
Yeah, but you remember what different countries have said. Could you, in the public sessions, could you just sort of give us a bit of a, I mean, without saying what what Donald Trump thinks, right? Or Elon Musk thinks, if you could just basically give us an idea of what sort of comes up in the negotiation on the other beneficiaries, like kind of what does the lay of the land look like?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Jamie. We need to stay in listening mode. But we're very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us.
All right. Okay. Sorry, didn't mean to come across too provocative like that. So, okay. Well, I think we can move on a bit. I think people sort of understand. Are there any other beneficiaries other than governments that are and collection societies or some kind of state sanctioned entity you think?
May I say something? It again very much important what kind of expressions of folklore are involved. Music is one thing. Then what is very much important is that the folklore market, I mean that their products are presented. Of course, there the beneficiaries are those the direct beneficiaries who sell, but the state and the government comes in to protect the expressions as such that in the market there shouldn't be some products which do not correspond to the idea of expressions of folklore, but in a way they replace them. They are not really folklore. There are various countries, there are juries. They can only go on the folklore product market if there is a approval by a jury. There is a mark, kind of like trademark, but it's not the same. So it very much depends what kind of folklore is involved. Folktale, music, music is exercise, collective management organization, this way or that way. The question is how they take it into account.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to move on a bit right now to the next article, which is Article 4.
When wants to say something, he has found the hand. hand symbol.
I'm sorry, it went. Go ahead.
Thanks. I've lost the camera, but I found my hand. I thought we were on Article 4, Jamie. So I wanted I thought we were wrapping up on Article 4. I just had a quick comment on Article 4. If now is the good time, I can mention it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just a general comment actually is, at WIPO, we no longer do reports of these meetings, which is a pity, but they're just so everybody knows, there are transcripts available. So one can look to see who said what, and these are, I think they're called speech to text transcripts, and they're on the website. So if anybody wants to look up things, they can. And I thought at IGC 49, a delegation made an interesting distinction between the beneficiaries of the instrument versus the beneficiaries of protection under the instrument. And beneficiaries of the instrument could include things like the wider public and society at large. And that's the issue which we touched on earlier. I thought there was an interesting distinction, and I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
But may I say that the question is who can authorize this, and who can collect the money? So that's the to which everything should boils down. So if somebody is the beneficiary in principle but doesn't exercise the right, then it's a beneficiary of course the society. That's another matter. But who authorizes and who collects and how distribute if collects? So these, I think, we may have some general principles, but these are the most important parts of a treaty, if there will be a treaty.
Yeah, does that come to okay. All right. Yeah. So well, let's Article 4 is pretty short in the
Marco Dallas.
yeah, and you have the main beneficiaries really seem come out here as indigenous peoples and local communities. And you may, under national law, specify other beneficiaries who create. Wow, that's interesting. In Article 4, it says the other beneficiaries would be people who create the traditional cultural expressions other than indigenous peoples or local communities. So I'm not sure what that means. When do you understand what they mean by other beneficiaries who create traditional cultural expressions in Article 4? I mean, because the state wouldn't be creating the cultural expressions, right? I don't think. If they're not a local community, and if they're not indigenous, what would they be? I'm talking about 4.2 in alternative 1 on beneficiaries.
Jamie, in Africa, in the great majority of national laws provide that there are bureaus and correspond to collective management organizations, but state and private elements are mixed up. They collect remuneration, and in general, it's used for general cultural purposes or the promotion of creativity.
No.
So that I mentioned that this is what exists. So it may be transformed into special communities.
No, but I'm looking at something very specific. It says other beneficiaries who create the traditional cultural expression. So
Jamie, Marco from Switzerland raised his hand.
I'm sorry, Marco, weigh in on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And actually, I'm also more in a listening mode in this meeting, because I think it's a good opportunity to learn from experts how they see the things here. I just want to mention, what Ben mentioned earlier, that we had very good discussions around the term beneficiaries in the IGC 49, maybe to find a way forward on that, to look on, to be more precise when we are talking of the term beneficiary, what we really mean. Do we really mean the rights holders, or do we mean some other kind of entities benefiting from some kind of protection? So I think this is the way we should look at that. And I would be very much interested to hear from you guys that are much more expert than probably many of us that are negotiating this instrument, to just have what is in an IP term, your understanding if you use the term beneficiaries. Is this exactly the same as the right holder, or could it in an IP context be something different as well? So this is something that seems to be confusing in the discussions, as that's at least my observation. I think some delegations, they think about benefiting, or who is benefiting from the instrument and who is benefiting, and they don't maybe think in an IP context on the term beneficiaries. And I was wondering whether you can help us on that one. Thanks.
I mean, just my impression on this is it's just the structure of the deal is normally in an IP thing, you have like the author or the inventor or the business which has a mark or something like that, and you know, or in data it could be like the entity which did a clinical trial and got data rights or something. But here, the people typically are not identified that created the expression, and they're just a bunch of people that, like, it's part of their world, it's part of their culture. And so it's much more difficult, as other people have indicated, to indicate who gives consent, who gets the money, and stuff like that. And so the beneficiary seems to be a broader concept here of like, however it's implemented, it's supposed to, at the end of the day, benefit the people that are described in the treaty. It's supposed to be something that's in the interest of indigenous peoples and local communities, not just in the sense of having some legal right to negotiate a contract, even if that's not practical in some cases. But it has to be, maybe other people can comment, but it seems to me like it's more, it should be in their interests, I think, in some ways. But yeah, at some point you do have to describe who gives consent, who gets the money, that sort of thing. I'm guessing. I'm certain. Is that right, Marco? Is that your understanding, kind of?
Well, yes, I mean, I think this is like the discussion we need to have. I mean, we need to be more precise, I think, also in the IGC sessions, what we understand on these specific terms, because if the understandings are different, we will not be able to move forward on this issue, I think.
Okay, thanks. So if we go to Article 5, which is 1, 2, 3, 4 pages long. This one has the facilitator's alternative, which is a whole page, more than a page. It's like more than one page, and then you have the alternative 2, alternative 3. So there's an alternative 1, I guess. So there's I don't know where alternative 1 is. I guess facilitator's alternative is considered 1. So anyway, it's like, it's long. It's 4 pages long. And so people want to talk about this because it's the alternatives are pretty different from each other. You have a lot of reasonable and balanced expressions, which I think are controversial. You have a lot of expressions to exclusive rights. You have scope of protection. Some let's see, maybe just focusing, is the facilitator's alternative like the most important one to be focusing on, or some of the other alternatives more? How would you direct people to get their head around what's going on in Article 5? Because it's pretty complicated.
Yeah, Jamie, it is very long, and just the article, sorry, the Alt 1 is, at least in my printout, it's a bit hidden. It's at the bottom of page 11, so it's a bit hard to see, but that's where the Alt 1 starts.
Oh, I see. Oh, gotcha.
Printout at least, yeah. A bit confusing. I can see that in the formatting. Without going into the detail, but here the broad lines of the discussion are one between rights versus measures, right? And one can, of course, have both, but that's one axis of the discussion. The other is between mandatory and voluntary obligations. That's another axis. Something else that maybe we haven't talked enough about is the distinction between positive incentives to change behavior in a positive way and negative incentives to discourage behavior that we don't want. And there are no positive incentives, I don't think, in the text. And that's something that Scott talked about, I think, is that might be something worth thinking about. And the other feature of Article 5 is that we see the so-called tiered approach. This is an approach that was actually came up in a meeting in Bali many, many years ago. And I was there with Chairman McCook at the time.
Which part of the text are you talking about now in 5?
It's all through Article 5, Jamie. It's an approach that differentiates the level of protection to TCEs according to the extent that they have been diffused, to put it very simply and very shortly. So, for example, one could.
Oh, I got it. It's supposed to secret or
right. So you'd have, let's say, 4 categories. You have secret TCEs, you have sacred TCEs, you have narrowly diffused TCEs, and widely diffused TCEs. If you took those 4 categories, then you would attach different levels of protection to each of them in relation to how publicly available they are. And so that is the approach that came up in this meeting in Bali. And it was discussed intensively at IGC 27. And it's now become part of the text. And it actually was the approach of the very first text that we drafted, that the Secretariat drafted back in about 2004, 2005. And that is infused throughout Article 5. And I can't speak for member states, but there are different views on it. But it's certainly been part of the text for a number of years now.
Could you explain why the word peoples is always on brackets, but indigenous is not? Is that because people want to limit the protection to indigenous local communities? I mean, is that and effectively making it so local communities would be left out unless they're indigenous, or is there, I mean, or is it just they don't like the word peoples? I mean, why is the word peoples in brackets all over the place?
There's a sensitivity in some countries, Jamie, about the word peoples with a capital P. So capital PS. There's a sensitivity around that. And so that's why the term has always been bracketed in that way in the TCE stream of the work. It became unbracketed in the diplomatic conference last year. So in the new treaty of last May, you'll see the expression is unbracketed. And it may well be that member states in this track of the work will follow the agreement of the treaty of last year. So the brackets would eventually come out. But that's up to the member states, of course.
Now, scope of protection is pretty important. Are there people here in the call that would like to make a comment on Article 5? I think it's very helpful, this idea of diffusion, having a nuanced set of obligations. Okay.
I remember that I first described it in the Bali meeting as a pyramid approach, and Preston jumped down my throat straight away because a pyramid implies a kind of top-down or a sort of hierarchy or a narrowing at the top and broad at the base. So I quickly changed language and became the tiered approach.
Oh, okay. Well, it's I think it's really a useful way to get your head around it, I think. Now, I'm trying to figure out, somewhere in the text, there's a lot of references to fair, I mean, like prior consent. Yeah. Trying to figure which articles get into Matt and mutually agreed. Let's see. No, oh, the Matt is not in here, right? They don't have reference to mutually agreed terms in this text, right? I think I saw that in some of the
That's
other.
more in the TK. The TK text is more sort of CBD inspired. We've got the reference to FPIC here, free, prior, and informed consent, but I don't think Matt. I think you're right.
And can you remember what article the free prior it's a free prior? I mean, how did?
Yeah, FPIC. I can see it, for example, here in the facilitated alternative paragraph C. It appears there, at least just quickly. I can see that now. It might appear elsewhere too.
Yeah, that's right. Free, prior, and informed consent, right? Now, I would consider free, prior, and informed consent really a pretty high standard for protection. I mean, that kind of rules out but this doesn't say that everything has to be that way, right? This just says in cases where you believe, well, I don't know. I mean, in C, you could kind of interpret it, I guess, as you have to do it. But free, prior, and informed consent, I mean, that's a higher standard than you have for copyright or patents, for example, where you can have compulsory licenses, remuneration regimes, extended licensing. You have all kinds of things that don't have free, prior, and informed consent for rights. Correct? I mean, this is a pretty. Would you agree? IP experts on the call, Louise, from Chile. Would you agree with that? That free, prior, and informed consents are pretty high level of protection.
Well,
So,
it does seem very high. Yeah, of course. I mean, prior informed consent requires a positive act of the one who's going to make the use with regard to the owner of the right. So certainly that's very complex, and that brings the issue of like what happens in copyright or patent where you have orphan works where it's a big percentage. Probably Michael has better number than me, but there's a huge number of works that today in copyright that nobody knows who is the owner of the rights, so you cannot clear the rights, and then that creates a bag of many works that cannot be used because there's no one to ask the permission. So that's why laws require to have specific regime for orphan, and so that's an example of why it seems high, the standard of prior informed consent.
yeah, I know in the orphan drug legislation, which hasn't passed in the United States yet because of some, but went pretty far. There was the idea that you could, you had to do a diligent effort to identify the owners, and if you couldn't do it, you could use the work. But if the owner then later showed up, then you had certain obligations. it would kick in at a later date, but you were not absolutely required to get permission before you'd use the work. That was the whole point of the orphan works legislation. And Scott, did you follow the orphan works debate on this sort of thing as to how I mean, it was, I think there would be no real orphan works legislation if they didn't do this, right? They didn't have it, if they required prior. I mean, that's the whole point of the orphan works legislation, right? Is to be able to use something without prior authorization if you've met a burden of a diligent search, right?
Yeah, that's my understanding, but it's not something I've really been on top of.
Jamie, Graham has his hand up.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's just really a question, actually, rather than a comment. But really, for Vend, actually, I mean, are we really embarked on treaty-based negotiations here, or might we end up with something like a declaration? Because I think it's really important, because it's a declaration. It could be in some ways more far-reaching in certain respects, because countries might agree to a declaration because they know it's not legally binding. Whereas if it's something that is going to be legally binding, there's going to be a lot more pushback, and I think the ambitions in terms of what you're going to achieve in the text, into the detail and substance, is going to be quite a bit less. So I just think, it's important to know where we're likely to be going to in these talks.
I think they're focused on a treaty. That's my opinion.
At the moment, yeah.
Kind of shocked.
But that could change, couldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what do you think?
Yeah. Does Vent have a?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't. Yeah. Well, again, I can't speak for the member states, but I would refer to the mandate of the IGC, which leaves it very open. So the opening paragraph, or one of the early paragraphs, talks about without prejudging the nature of outcomes. And the specific instructions or directions given to the IGC sessions at the moment refer to a draft legal instrument. And we all know that the term instrument is very, very broad. Yeah, I might refer again to my earlier suggestion about guardrails or sort of guiding principles, which would be helpful for maybe steering the negotiations on these sort of process issues, which might be helpful.
Now, KEI has recently taken the position in several WIPO negotiations that more attention should be given to model laws. And we think model laws have some advantages in the sense they can be, I think Graham has suggested, more aspirational. They can provide a bit more flexibility in terms of implementation, and they can be a bit more, it can go aspirational. It says you can go further in a model law than you could in a treaty, because people are going to water down the treaty to conform to their national laws a lot of times. And the other thing is that sometimes treaties aren't have mistakes. I mean, sometimes things are moving pretty fast. We haven't talked about AI or a lot of other things that are going on right now, but because treaties last so long and they're so durable, that model laws, the truest model law, and I think people that have followed it, it was implemented pretty widely, actually, and not only in the folklore provisions, but the copyright provisions were widely, in some countries, were almost cut and paste from the truest model law back in 1976. So one question would be, is there a real appetite in the IGC to develop something that looked more like a model law? The thing about the difference is the treaty language doesn't really look like a model law. A treaty language sort of higher level, and a model law is more implementable, cut and paste like. And Mahele's worked on a couple of model laws, and they would often have like options, like option A and option B, to provide a bit more flexibility in terms of what they do. But Mahele, would you like to comment a bit on the experience?
Jamie, there was the so-called guided development period in the 80s when there were some new questions, and then we didn't touch the binding norms, but we developed model laws, guiding principles, and so on. And then some of them later became binding norms. For example, there were some guiding principles of the protection of software, protection of databases, satellite broadcasting, and so on. And later, first they became part of at least software and databases of the TRIPS agreement and the WCT. So it's possible that something is now adopted as a kind of soft law or model provisions. It depends how soft it is, but not necessarily binding, or maybe a lot of alternatives, which is very close to what is binding, but it's not. For example, in the Berne Convention, there is a provision about the resale right. It is in the convention, but it's not binding actually, because no. So what I have to say is that it wouldn't be a bad idea. You can take the Tunis model law, which is about everything. You can take the model provisions and to update this to include the new elements. The model provisions, I don't want to. It has got the advantages that it is relatively simple. So, and it's ready. So you may change it, improve it, build in everything which has been discussed, or make it less, more flexible, or who knows. I think that it wouldn't be a bad idea to consider later that, for example, in 1982, we adopted model provisions with the idea to go to a higher level, to transform this into binding norms. We didn't succeed in 1984, but who knows, it may happen now.
Okay, I think that's very helpful background, and I know you have a lot of extensive experience. I also want to correct myself. Earlier I mentioned three-step tests as like one decision. There was two WTO three-step tests. Well, you could call them three-step tests. There was a copyright case involving the Irish music case, the EU and the United States, and then there was a Canada-EU case on pharmaceuticals, and they both kind of look at different versions of how you might think about the three-step test. So I don't want to go into that too much right now, but if I could go to Article 6, which is administration of rights and interest. I think we'll skip this and go right to limitation and exceptions, Article 7, because this is one that a lot of people on the call work on, limitations and exceptions. Some of them hate them, some of them love them. Some of them love them for some purposes and hate them for others. What I found interesting in this negotiation is that the countries that are generally pushing for limitations and exceptions in patents and copyrights, some of them have opposed limitations and exceptions, being very liberal for traditional knowledge, and vice versa. So you sort of see the Group B countries being like, they like limitations and exceptions in this negotiation, and maybe they don't like them in a different negotiation. So does anyone want to comment on what you think limitations and exceptions, what are sort of the, I mean, we can always go to Wen because he knows so much about the negotiation to sort of give a little bit of a landscape of how people have been kind of approaching this. But I think that what you see in Article 7, in some cases, you have kind of a simple three-step framework. And at the last one, I made they let me make a fairly extensive intervention from the floor, reminding people that there's not one three-step test. There's like 23-step tests, and they're all different from each other. And whether or not they're a funnel under which all exceptions have to go through, or the one that you use if the other ones, which are sometimes referred to as specific or particular exceptions, don't work. And I can elaborate on that if you want, but like what you see is a similar kind of thing here. You have some things where you like some of the alternatives would say for learning, teaching, preservation, display, research, you have different kinds of exceptions kind of set out. the Indigenous Caucus doesn't like any limitations and exceptions. They take a really hard line on this. In my talks with people in the Indigenous Caucus, I said, well, you can negotiate a treaty with yourself and have like an awesome looking text that nobody wants to ratify. And so at some point, you have to kind of figure out why people would want to ratify your treaty. And if you don't give them enough flexibility in doing it, they're probably not going to sign it. So, you know, we had to deal with that in the Treaty for the Blind. I mean, we were negotiating between KEI and the WBU. I mean, we were negotiating with like everyone, right? So, to what extent do limitation and exceptions work in a treaty where some of the things that people are talking about are trade secrets? I mean, like secret, you know, some of them are sacred, some of them are widely diffused. So going back to when it's like tiered or GUPAs, you know, so the idea that you have sacred, secret, closely disseminated a little bit and disseminated a lot. I mean, like, how would you? Are those concepts even are they adequately addressed in the different proposals for limitations and exceptions? Now, I'd like to hear from people that follow the negotiations on limitations and exceptions to see what they think of the current alternatives.
May I say something?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I think that something I said at the beginning that certain specific exceptions may be mentioned after all, such as education and some similar things. And then I've said that in addition to that, there may be something, the function of which may be similar to the three-step test. But the three-step test cannot be applied directly because there are certain categories in it which very, very difficultly could be applied as copyright, many aspects copyright in general, exploitation, the legitimate interest of right holders. And then you are there again at the problem that who are the right holders? And so something is needed, some kind of general framework where we may apply access limitations, but not necessarily the three-step test or the adapted version of the three-step test. That's how I can see it.
When do you want to, it seems like the facilitator's alternative follows that tiered approach you were talking about.
Yeah,
It's not,
if one follows the tiered approach, then the exceptions have to mirror that, right? It has to be the sort of same system. And so on this article, a fundamental question, of course, is do you need an article like this of exceptions if it's only a measures-based approach? And that, because that hasn't yet been decided whether it's a rights-based and or measures-based system. It might be that if there are no new rights established, then there would be no exceptions to those rights. And that's exactly what happened in the May Treaty, right? The DIPCON that was held in May. Exceptions Article 4 was taken out because it was always felt it didn't belong in that treaty because that's not a rights-based treaty. I found the reference to what the caucus said about no exceptions. They did say that again. I think it was Preston speaking at the 49th session. And then, of course, there's the other points of view about artistic freedom, cultural diversity, artistic borrowing, all the same discussions, Michaeli, we had in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And it's the same sort of tension. And I think that's really all I can add at this stage.
I'll make a quick comment. I'm going to call on Graham. I think he has his hand up or wants to say something. But in my view, if there were more flexible language on limitations and exception, it would help in any kind of ratification of any instrument or any kind of adoption of any kind of agreement that went forward. But if it's too close, it's just going to make it really less likely that certain countries will want to embrace it. Graham, you wanted to say something on the limitation and exceptions.
Well, just a short thing. Yeah, obviously, I don't think the Indians caucus are going to get this. But maybe some compromise language, it could be an optional thing to provide limitations and as you see fit, may provide. I just wonder if that might possibly work. Maybe not.
I will note that 7.1, which is the in the facilitators, is very similar to the three-step test in the TRIPS for patents, but it's very different from the three-step test for copyright in the TRIPS agreement. And of course 7.2. The thing I thought was kind of hard to understand in 7.2 is so suppose, for example, you're one country, let's say you're Switzerland, and then and there's another country, let's call it Indonesia, and I don't, or it could be a different country. I don't want to single those guys out too seriously. Just to sort of say there's two different countries. So with the country doing the limitations and exceptions, have to make sure the limitation exception didn't conflict with any customary laws of traditional expressions anywhere in the planet. I mean, like usually when you do limitation exceptions, you're kind of looking at balancing interests between parties in your own country, or maybe have a, maybe you have to pay attention to investors in another country or something like that. But like that 7.2 seems to be a pretty strict condition that it can't conflict with any national law unless it's just if it's in your own country, it's obvious, because in your own country, of course, you're not going to conflict it with your own national law in your own country. But that sort of suggests to me, maybe I'm reading it wrong, that you can't conflict with customary laws in any country. Am I wrong about that? When 7.2 facilitators alternative on Article 7?
Yeah, Jamie, I think you're right. I'm just switching to my phone to try and get my video to work. That helps.
I like 7.3 that you have to make sure that the views of people in local communities guide the development of any exceptions they adopt. That seems like a really positive thing. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Go ahead.
Just if you, so I haven't followed everything now because I've done so many other things that following the discussion in the IGC, the more so because recently the discussions went rather to the other aspects on the agenda, not traditional cultural expressions. So I do not know exactly the difference between measures and rights, but in any way, if you consider, I don't know how, in a kind of May treaty or a shared treaty or a model law, you consider, for example, the obligation to pay for certain uses of the expressions of folklore, then it is justified also to consider that when you do not have to pay. So in that respect, at least, the exceptions, limitations of such kind of obligation or measure, or so it is justified to raise this issue and to give some kind of answer to that. That's and then there are some really obvious cases, and then these are the obvious cases also in the Berne Convention that, for example, I don't say quotation because who knows, but may not be. But for example, education, and then. But then and you also spoke at the beginning about the principle of protection or measures or anything in a balanced way. And then if you say more about how to balance, because the three-step test is about the balance in a certain way. In the case of such kind of instrument, it may be different, but some more detailed might be justified if you foresee certain kind of obligations, pay or authorization in certain cases. Of course, in the case of sacred folklore, it's different. Why to have any exception? That's completely different.
Actually, if you look at alternative 3 in Article 7, it really kind of follows that framework. The 7.1 is kind of a nuanced 3-step test. It's called general exceptions, and then they have a provision 7.2 that there shouldn't be exceptions when it comes to things that are sacred or secret. You can argue whether that's the right language to it, but that's what they call general exceptions. And then they have what they call specific exceptions, which I think you're referring to, Mihail, about things very, very common to what you'd see in the Berne Convention and Rome Convention. And then in some ways, even in the TRIPS, you see some things like this in the patent size. And then so there is this sort of breakdown of general exceptions, specific exceptions, and things that are different for things, whether they're secret or whether they're sacred. I think what's complicated in this throughout the treaty is the fact that you do have these really, really widely different things included in the same thing. But Went, your hand is up. I'm going to call you right now. When
thanks, Jamie. Yes, I switched to my phone. I just wanted to add one suggestion, which is about the text as a whole, and that is again drawing on the lessons from the treaty adopted last year. The explanatory notes that accompanied the basic proposal, or at least the chair's text, were extremely helpful. I thought they were very helpful for all the delegates. And I think explanatory notes for a text like this would also be very, very helpful.
Yeah, thank you. I will say that in the SSCR negotiation, we found some of the explanatory notes confusing on some topics that we follow for the broadcast treaty. But I think you're certainly in the case of the one last year, I would agree with you. They were helpful for that negotiation, in my opinion, particularly as someone like me who was not an expert in the negotiation at the time. Because we're running up against, we're already past my 2-hour time. I did want to talk really briefly about a couple of things before we quit here for people that we still have, but like the term of protection, Article 8, I think that the various versions are perpetual, or as long as they meet the standards for protection, things like that. I think we can all agree that the term of protection is this really, really long thing. And I think that the concern, I'll just want to express like our concern would be, now, in traditional knowledge, I think this has been a bigger problem for us, because in traditional knowledge, we'd have the idea that there might be some fundamental medical thing that could have a right that never ended, and it could be licensed by a right owner to Pfizer or something like that, and it would be not subject to any limitations and exceptions, and it would last forever. And we thought, well, we don't want that, right? And so the idea that it's something that's like lasts forever makes it kind of more challenging for us. Although I will say that copyrights have been headed in that direction in the United States. It's almost forever, but it's not forever. But it is, I think just by its very nature, I think people kind of, it's going to be, infinite or almost that. But on formalities, that seemed like a non-controversial thing in the negotiation, but I didn't understand why, because formalities are already used in a lot of things. I mean, like in the trademarks, for example, formalities are the basis of trademark protection. I mean, and patent protection as well. I mean, like you just don't get protection without formalities in those particular areas. And the thing Scott was referring to about like wanting to know whether or not you had something that you had to acknowledge or you had to address. I mean, it seems like it should be flexible on formalities. I think this is an article that would be better off just deleted. But if you, I had the impression, and maybe other people can share the thoughts of this, is that in the negotiation, a lot of the indigenous community was looking at things like the most favorable thing for right owners, like no limitations, no formalities. I mean, everything they wanted was kind of cropped in here. But I think it's short-sighted to rule out formalities. And also, if you look at what's going on in AI right now, there's a big conversation about, do you remunerate people for having benefited from some input to train the AI? And the formalities become really important in that, because if you can't identify what you did and who owned it or who the beneficiary is, it really makes it difficult to imagine getting the remuneration thing done well. But why did they feel? I mean, is this something? I mean, the Rome Convention said nothing on formalities, for example.
Yeah, it says something. The letter P around that it's sufficient if you indicate if this P in a circle, then it means that if there is protection, it suffices for that. That's it. But it's an alternative, so it's not an obligation, not necessarily. But what is the advantage of formalities from the viewpoint of, because first you have to identify what you register, for example. For this, the most important condition for any protection in the digital online world should be fulfilled first, namely that you should somehow digitize or somehow identify.
Well,
the absolute obstacle to protection, if you don't register, for example, would be a bad idea. But to obtain some advantages, that's another matter, like in the US.
Well, I mean, they do make reference to registers and other records, and in designs, I know, like, I was recently in a diplomatic conference in Saudi Arabia. They talk about design. I mean, I can imagine that countries may want to register designs that they think are protected for coming from traditional heritage. I mean, like, it may be in their interest to do it, and it may for certain types, because it's so broad what's covered by traditional cultural expressions. It's really, really broad. It's important to remember that for certain types of protected things, that in order, like Paramount was talking earlier about how the uncertainty is really challenging for people. So formalities is something that makes it easier for the people that might want to use the traditional cultural expression in a way that would be remunerated, for example. And countries may not mind people using it. It may be something they want to make money from. They may like money. They may like the fact that people are exploiting it for fashions or something like that. And design protection is something that you see a lot of formalities and databases and things like that. So I'm not sure why you'd want to take such a hard line against this sort of thing. I mean, it does say with a facilitator's text, without prejudice to the maintenance of registered or other records. But there may be cases when you want to, like like some jurisdictions, like you can get the right, but you can't enforce the right without a formality. And there may be an examination procedure for whether or not you're entitled to protection. I mean, that's
Jamie, in the case of design, there is a registered design protection, unregistered design protection. It is in that category where the protection of the form, design, and so on. So in the fourth category where it may emerge that, but not necessarily in the other three, such as music and so on.
well,
James,
Lucho Villarroel.
mi querido Mijael,
¿Cómo estás?
muy bien, muy bien. Well, thank you, James, again for giving me the floor. So on the issue of formalities, I think that there is a lot of issues that arise of lack of formalities, particularly with regard, when it comes to distribution, of rights. We know all the complexities of collecting societies trying to find the right holder. So we know that there are some clear benefits from formalities, although of course there are some downsides. And if we see the new instruments that are being negotiated in WIPO, we see that in the broadcasting treaty, the current draft text by the chair, it recognizes the possibility of countries include a formality that refers that the sign to be protected has to have some data on some essential data with regard to the right owner. So I think that there is now a sense of understanding the need and benefit of having some type of formality. So I won't rule out the optional formalities in one hand, and also I will maybe draw a distinction between the type of this knowledge. I mean, this popular products. Maybe we should not be thinking to have the same protection for all kind of products, but have some formalities for some and none for others. But I think we should give it a thought on formalities.
Thank you very much. Now we're over the time limit, and many people have scheduled other meetings. I'd like to wind up because I don't want to go like too much over the scheduled time, out of respect for people that have joined us. But before we wind this up, I'd like to thank everyone that participated and listened in, and we'll get back to you because now we know you're sort of interested in the topic, if we have anything to share. But if anyone wants to add any closing comments before I end the meeting, go ahead and raise your hand, and we'd love to hear what you have to say. No, everyone's said what they have to say. Okay. Well, listen, thanks everyone for participating. It's really been a helpful conversation for us, and I think I'll be seeing some of you probably and first week in March when the discussions take up again. Thank you again. Bye.
Un abrazo a todos.
Cheers, everybody. Bye. Thank you, Jamie. Thanks, Tiru. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.